Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
You ever have one of those moments where the silence in the room is so thick it presses against your chest, like the walls are waiting to see if you're serious? That's exactly what I felt when I told my entire family, right after Thanksgiving dinner, that I had quit my job. And not just any job, a damn good one. 6 figures, a corner office, quarterly bonuses fat enough to make you feel like a king if you squint hard enough and ignore how dead you are inside. I told them I walked away from all of that to go freelance. You'd think I just confessed to being a flat earther or told them I was moving to Mars to herd goats. My mom's fork clinked against her wine glass like a gunshot. Her mouth dropped open, not in surprise, but that kind of silent judgment where you already know she thinks you're a disappointment, and this just confirms it. "You quit that job at Hargrove?" she asked, her voice trembling like she might faint from the shame. I nodded, calm on the outside, because I'd rehearsed this moment in my head at least 50 times, and every version ended with some kind of movie-worthy applause. Instead, I got laughter. Real, gut-level, head-thrown-back laughter. Uncle Rick was the first to break. "So you're gonna be a blogger now," he wheezed, like that was the most idiotic thing a man in his mid-30s could say. Cousin Dave, the same guy who spent 10 years installing HVAC systems and still lives in the same house his parents gave him, mumbled under his breath, "Guess we know who's showing up broke next Thanksgiving." I could have said a lot in that moment. Could have told them how long I'd been dying inside at Hargrove, how the cubicle felt more like a padded cell, how I'd stare at spreadsheets and wonder if this was really it. 40 more years of selling marketing packages to board executives, while my soul rotted under fluorescent lights. But I didn't. I just smiled and said, "I'm building something." They rolled their eyes. Every single one of them. Like I was a teenager announcing I was starting a garage band or launching a YouTube channel with no followers. I watched the disbelief roll through the room like smoke, settling on everyone's faces, clouding any memory they ever had of me being the reliable one, the straight-laced one, the guy who never missed a deadline and always showed up in a collared shirt. I wasn't drunk, but I felt dizzy. Maybe it was from holding my ground while they chipped away at me with every sarcastic comment and every raised eyebrow. My sister, Laura, who hasn't worked in 5 years and still complains about how expensive almond milk is, chimed in with, "So what? You're just gonna sit at home all day in your pajamas and hustle?" The way she said hustle made it sound like a disease. That was the last family gathering I went to for a while. Not because I was mad, okay? Maybe I was a little mad, but mostly because I needed space. Space to fail without their smug faces reminding me they told me so. Because I knew there was a chance I'd fall flat on my face. I wasn't naive. I didn't have a safety net, and I sure as hell didn't have a rich investor uncle or a startup fund. I had savings, a laptop, and a fire in my gut that burned hotter than their laughter. You know, I used to think respect was given to the people who earned it. Turns out, in families like mine, respect is reserved for people who stick to the damn script. You go to school, you get a job, you buy a house, you hate your life quietly, and if you break that pattern, even for something noble like happiness or freedom or sanity, you get written off as crazy. And yeah, maybe I was crazy. Crazy enough to believe I could build a business from scratch. Crazy enough to work 16-hour days for clients who ghosted me, to chase down invoices like a bounty hunter, to stare at my bank balance and wonder if buying gas or groceries was the smarter move this week. But in that moment, surrounded by faces that once cheered me on when I brought home my first company car and now stared at me like I'd joined a cult, I made a decision. I wasn't gonna try to win them over. I wasn't gonna defend myself every time someone made a joke at my expense. I was just gonna keep going, quietly, until the day came when I wouldn't need to say a damn thing. Until the day they'd see for themselves. So when they laughed, I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I let them laugh. And then I went home, opened my laptop, and got back to work. What would you do if your entire family thought you were a joke? Would you fight for your dream, or play it safe to keep their approval? Drop it in the comments, I want to know who's been there. The first year felt like one long, slow unraveling of everything I used to count on: money, structure, confidence, and honestly, my damn sanity some days, all stripped down to the bones while I smiled through gritted teeth and told everyone it was part of the process. The truth was, it didn't feel like a process. It felt like drowning with nobody willing to throw me a rope, especially not the people who claimed to love me most. Freelancing, to them, was a cute word for unemployment. It was a punchline. It was a phase I'd grow out of. They said it in polite tones at first, but I could hear the bite underneath. The first few months weren't glamorous. Hell, they weren't even manageable. I lived on cheap ramen. The good stuff was 2 for $1 if you knew where to look, and rationed my groceries like I was prepping for the Great Depression. My internet got cut off twice because I prioritized paying rent over connectivity, and once I had to finish a rush job by parking outside a Starbucks at midnight, stealing Wi-Fi through cracked windows while my laptop battery blinked at 10%. You know what that job paid? Not a dime. Just exposure. That magic word everyone in the creative world seems to throw around like it's some kind of holy currency. I was 29 years old, eating expired cereal and getting paid in compliments. My parents, who used to call twice a week to ask about my job and my career path, slowly started calling less. The check-ins turned into awkward silences where they asked how things were going, and I'd say busy, because saying I cried into my keyboard for half an hour after a client ghosted me didn't really fit the family tone. Eventually, they stopped asking altogether. The family group chat? It went quiet. No more sarcastic gifs from my cousins or passive-aggressive memes from Aunt Gina. I guess when you're not winning, you're not really in the club anymore. But the real gut punch came at the next family barbecue, about 6 months into this mess. I almost didn't go. I didn't want to answer questions, didn't want the smug glances, the way they'd ask, "So how's the little business going?" like they were talking to a toddler with a lemonade stand. But I showed up anyway, because some stubborn part of me thought maybe if they saw I was still standing, still trying, maybe they'd finally shut the hell up and let me breathe. I pulled up in a rusted, sun-faded 2002 Toyota Camry that rattled like a soda can full of bolts, the front bumper half held together with duct tape and prayer. I parked behind my cousin Dave's brand new Chevy Silverado, lifted, spotless, chrome rims that probably cost more than my whole car. He'd just bought a house 2 blocks from my parents. Had a baby on the way. New promotion. They threw him a surprise party the month before. Meanwhile, I'd just gotten stiffed by a graphic design client from Michigan who promised me exposure and ghosted after I delivered the final files. As soon as I stepped out of the car, I could feel it. That shift in the air. The kind that makes you hyper-aware of every stare, every pause in conversation, every whisper. Dave walked over, beer in hand, and clapped me on the shoulder like I was his struggling younger brother, even though we were born the same damn year. "Still doing the online hustle thing?" he asked, grinning like it was a joke only he understood. I forced a laugh. "Still building," I said, like a man laying bricks with bare hands. The day went by in a haze of half-burned burgers, plastic chairs that wobbled in the grass, and small talk that felt like landmines. Aunt Gina asked if I was still single, with a smirk that told me she already knew the answer and felt sorry for me. Someone mentioned a job opening at a local firm, said it might be more stable than what I was doing. I nodded, thanked them, pretended I'd think about it. All while counting down the minutes until I could get the hell out of there. I drove home with the windows down, because the AC had finally died and fixing it wasn't in the budget. I stared out at the road, thinking about how this wasn't supposed to be how it felt. I was supposed to be chasing freedom, not scraping together enough to pay for gas. I kept asking myself, why was I doing this? Was the dream still worth it if it looked like failure to everyone else? Was I proving something, or was I just too damn stubborn to quit? But here's the twisted thing. Part of me still believed. Even when the money ran thin, even when the doubt got loud, even when I felt completely invisible to the people who used to say they were proud of me, part of me still thought this pain had a purpose. That if I could just keep pushing, something would break open. Maybe not soon. Maybe not next month. But someday. And until then, I'd keep driving that rattling Camry, keep eating cheap noodles, and keep showing up, because quitting wasn't an option. Not anymore. Not after everything I'd already given up. And definitely not just to prove them right. There's a specific kind of silence that settles over you when it's 3 in the morning. The world outside your window is dead quiet, and the only sound in your apartment is the hum of a tired refrigerator and the clicking of your own damn teeth from stress. That's where I was, sitting cross-legged on the floor because my back couldn't take the cheap folding chair anymore, staring at a glowing laptop screen that blurred in and out of focus as my eyes begged for sleep I hadn't earned. Pizza boxes stacked like depressing architecture around me, half-empty cans of off-brand energy drinks, and that stale, sticky smell of takeout and desperation filling the air like fog. I hadn't showered in 2 days, hadn't shaved in a week, and I'd been wearing the same hoodie for so long it started to feel like part of my skin. The client, the one who said they'd wire me $2,000 by Friday, had vanished. No emails, no replies, no "hey, we're running late." Just nothing. Gone. I'd poured 30 hours into their rebranding package, rewritten their website copy 3 times because they kept changing their mind, and built their social media calendar down to the goddamn minute. And now, all I had to show for it was a blank inbox and a choking panic sitting in my chest like a fist. It wasn't the first time someone disappeared on me. That's the joy of freelancing when you're nobody, no company name behind you, no legal team, no backup. But this one was different because that $2,000 wasn't just a paycheck. It was my rent. It was groceries. It was the one thing standing between me and a call to my parents I swore I'd never make. My savings had dried up last month. My credit card was nearly maxed. And in the middle of that choking spiral, the person I thought would always have my back looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I need someone stable, Derek. I can't do this anymore." Jess wasn't wrong, and that's what made it worse. She'd stuck with me longer than she probably should have, watched me spiral from confident ex-corporate guy to half-broke mess chasing invoices like a bloodhound. She watched me skip dinner to meet deadlines, cancel plans to jump on last-minute calls, and smile through the exhaustion like I wasn't completely unraveling. But she also watched the joy leave my eyes, piece by piece. And in the end, it wasn't a fight or a betrayal or some dramatic movie moment. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when she packed a duffel bag and said she was moving back in with her sister. I didn't argue. I just nodded and watched her go, feeling too hollow to beg her to stay. That night, I didn't work. I didn't cry. I didn't drink. I just sat there in the dark, back against the wall, knees pulled to my chest like I was a damn teenager again. I opened my laptop, out of habit more than anything, and stared at my online banking screen, watching the balance flicker like some cruel joke. $57. That's what I had left. $57 to get me through a week, maybe 2, if I stretched it with frozen burritos and prayed the power stayed on. I remember whispering it out loud, like maybe saying it would help make sense of it all. What the hell am I doing? It came out like a confession, like I finally admitted to God or the universe or whoever the hell was watching that I didn't know anymore. I wasn't chasing a dream, I was running from a nightmare I'd built myself, convinced that success was just one more hustle away. And I wasn't even sure if I wanted it anymore. I just didn't want to feel like a failure. People love a comeback story, right? They love the grind, the hustle, the sleepless nights that lead to some shiny reward. But no one talks about the part where it feels like you're digging your own grave with every job you accept for less than you're worth, where every great opportunity turns into a gut punch, and where even the people who love you the most eventually get tired of watching you sink. This wasn't inspiring. This wasn't brave. It was ugly and humiliating and lonely as hell. And still, I didn't quit. I didn't sleep that night either. I stayed up refreshing my email, hoping that maybe, just maybe, that client would send the payment, that Jess would text and say she changed her mind, that something, anything would feel like a win. But nothing came. Just the glow of my screen, the weight of my choices pressing on my chest like 100-pound stone, and that cold realization that maybe I wasn't cut out for this after all. But in the deepest part of me, the part that refused to die no matter how many times it got punched in the gut, I held on. Not because I was brave, not because I was strong, but because if I gave up now, then every sacrifice would mean nothing. Jess would be right. My family would be right. That voice in my head whispering, "You're just a loser with Wi-Fi," would be right. And I couldn't live with that. Not yet. Not while there was still breath in my lungs and electricity in the damn wall. So I got up, microwaved the last slice of pizza, wiped the grease off my hands, and started sending out pitches again, not because I believed it would work, but because sometimes the only way to outrun the darkness is to move. The shift didn't come with fireworks or applause or some grand, redemptive moment that made all the suffering seem suddenly worth it. No, it came quietly, in the form of a cold email sent at 2:46 in the morning to a tech startup in Austin that probably wasn't even going to read it. Derek didn't expect a response, didn't have hope left to burn, didn't even double-check his spelling before hitting send. He just fired it off like a message in a bottle, tossed into the digital sea, one of dozens he had written that week to companies who never replied, or worse, replied with, "We'll keep you in mind," before disappearing forever. But that one did reply, and fast. They were called Trinex Solutions, a name that sounded like they sold overpriced smartwatches or electric dog collars, but they were actually a data infrastructure startup, looking to scale their brand and redo their messaging from top to bottom. Their current stuff was a disaster, clunky, buzzword-filled nonsense with no heart, and Derek knew he could fix it. He didn't pitch like he was desperate, though God knows he was. He pitched like someone who saw what they were trying to do and knew how to make it better. They scheduled a call the next day. He wore a wrinkled shirt and tried to clean the pizza box behind him off the webcam view. The internet glitched twice, and he could feel his throat tighten, panic climbing like a wildfire in his chest, but he pushed through it. And somehow, miraculously, they liked him. They liked him enough to give him a test project, then another, then ask him to take over all their brand strategy work for the next quarter. They paid fast. They paid fair. They sent him an actual contract, not just a vague email promise with a smiley face and a hope. He stared at the numbers on the invoice with numb disbelief. It wasn't $2,000. It was $5,000. And that wasn't even the full scope. When the payment hit his account, Derek didn't cheer. He didn't call anyone. He didn't post about it on social media with a hustle culture caption and a selfie. He just sat there, staring at the balance like it might vanish if he blinked too hard. Then he closed the banking tab, opened his invoices, and started planning what came next. He used half to pay the overdue rent. A quarter went to the internet bill, the electric company, and a stack of canned food he could live off for 2 weeks if things went south again. The rest? He tucked that away in a savings account and stared at it like a trophy no one else could see. More work followed. Trinex referred him to another startup and then another. One was in cybersecurity. One sold e-commerce analytics tools. None of them cared that he worked from a one-bedroom apartment with paint peeling in the hallway. They cared that his words converted, that his ideas weren't canned, that he delivered on time and without the corporate fluff that most agencies charged triple for. Derek became a ghostwriter, a strategist, a consultant, but he stayed quiet. He didn't post photos. He didn't tell the family. Not yet. When his mom called one afternoon to check in, he told her things were fine. She asked if he needed anything, and he said no, even though the electricity had just come back on after a 6-hour outage and his fridge was humming like it was about to die again. When his cousin Dave texted a group chat picture of his new grill and said, "Who's ready for summer BBQs?" Derek just liked the message and didn't say a word about how he'd just booked a $5,000 contract with a client in Berlin. Because this wasn't about bragging. Not anymore. He had decided, somewhere in the quiet, somewhere between the panic attacks and the pizza grease, that when he showed them, it wouldn't be with words. It would be with silence so loud they'd have to listen. He didn't want the "we knew you could do it" lines or the backhanded "I always said you were smart" bullshit. He wanted to wait. Not out of spite, but something deeper. Something heavier. A need to rise without needing their validation. To become undeniable. Late at night, when the jobs were done and the invoices sent, he'd sit back in his squeaky desk chair, open a new tab, and scroll through listings of luxury cars. Not because he was going to buy one tomorrow, and not because he wanted to show off, but because something about the smooth, quiet hum of those electric machines, the ones that didn't need to roar to be powerful, reminded him of who he was trying to be. He bookmarked one in particular, matte black, minimalist interior, self-driving features he'd never trust, but still admired. He'd stare at it sometimes before shutting the laptop for the night, just looking, not dreaming, not hoping. Planning. No one saw this part of his life. To the outside world, Derek was still freelancing. Still figuring things out. Still living in the same crappy apartment. Still driving that rattling Camry. Still the guy who took a break from real work. But underneath the surface, something had shifted. The water was rising. The foundation was building. And when it all came together, when the moment was finally right, they wouldn't hear it coming. They'd just see the shadow of something they couldn't explain pulling into the driveway, and by the time they realized what it was, he'd already be sitting inside with the engine humming quietly, watching their expressions shift from confusion to disbelief and maybe, just maybe, regret. But that day wasn't today. Today was about work. Tomorrow? That was his. The message popped into the family group chat on a Thursday morning, sandwiched between a meme from Aunt Gina about real men grilling with charcoal and a blurry picture of Cousin Dave's new backyard patio furniture that looked like it belonged in a discount Home Depot commercial. Derek hadn't opened the chat in over a month, maybe 2, but the name of the thread, Fam Bam Barbecue Bash 2025, caught his eye immediately, not because he was excited, but because some part of him still flinched at the idea of stepping back into that world where his worth was always measured in the most boring, predictable ways: salary, car model, square footage, how often you mowed your damn lawn. Big family reunion. That's what they were calling it. Capital letters and all. It was scheduled for late July, same park as usual, same folding chairs, same lukewarm potato salad. And the same undercurrent of competition that had always turned these gatherings into a weird sort of suburban gladiator match, where everyone smiled through their teeth while silently calculating who was doing best. Dave would be there, obviously, probably showing off his new Traeger grill and talking about interest rates like he invented home equity. Uncle Rick would bring a cooler full of Coors and start drinking by noon, and someone, probably Aunt Gina, would joke about how Derek still owed her a Tupperware from 3 Thanksgivings ago, like it was some hilarious symbol of his failure to keep his life together. Derek stared at the message for a long while before putting the phone down. He didn't respond. Not yet. But something stirred in him, something not quite anger and not quite pride, a feeling that had been simmering quietly under the surface for months now. He wasn't the same guy who pulled up in the duct-taped Camry last time, trying not to make eye contact while everyone danced around the fact that nobody believed in what he was doing. He had changed, and not just financially. He'd built something that nobody saw coming, and he'd done it without their help, without their support, without even their damn curiosity. Not one person had asked what freelancing really meant. Not one had said, "Hey, Derek, what exactly do you do these days?" They just assumed he was coasting on delusion, chasing some online pipe dream until the real world slapped him hard enough to drag him back to a desk job with a 401k and a soul slowly rotting behind a corporate login screen. But that wasn't the story anymore. Because now, in his garage, sat something sleek, something silent, something blacker than pride and smoother than any apology he'd never received. It didn't roar, it whispered. An all-electric performance machine, luxury stitched into every inch of its design, with a price tag that would make Dave's Silverado look like a child's toy on 4 oversized wheels. High 6 figures. No lease. No loan. Paid in full. Derek didn't buy it for them, not exactly. He bought it because he could, because after 3 years of scraping and sacrificing, after eating shame for breakfast and regret for dinner, he finally reached the place he'd imagined in those sleepless nights when quitting felt like suicide and showing up felt like war. But now that the reunion was on the table, the question started to eat at him in a different way. Was he going to show them? Did they even deserve to know? He hadn't told anyone. Not even his mom. Not his old college friends. Not the ex who once told him she couldn't build a life on vibes and invoices. The car wasn't an announcement, it was proof. But the thing about proof is, it still needs someone to witness it. And as much as he wanted to believe he'd moved beyond the need for validation, something about the idea of rolling up to that reunion, unannounced, unassuming, and unbothered, felt less like revenge and more like gravity. Like destiny finally turning its head his way. The decision wasn't immediate. He spent the next few days going back and forth in his mind, making excuses not to go, telling himself it was a waste of energy, a toxic environment, a place he didn't belong anymore. But late one night, after back-to-back client meetings and a new proposal he landed with a Fortune 500 company, he walked out to the garage, leaned against the hood of that silent, beautiful machine, and asked the question out loud. What the hell am I waiting for? He already knew the answer. This wasn't about proving them wrong, it was about proving himself right. And maybe, deep down, it was about letting them see the version of him they refused to imagine. The one they never thought could exist. The one they laughed at, pitied, and quietly dismissed every time he walked into a room with tired eyes and an uncertain smile. That Derek was gone. This new one didn't ask for permission. He just showed up. So he opened the group chat, scrolled past the memes and inside jokes that never quite included him, and typed one simple line: "Count me in. I'll be there." No exclamation points. No need for drama. Then he closed the phone, opened his laptop, and checked the calendar. 2 weeks. 2 weeks until he saw their faces, heard the comments, watched the double takes and the whispered questions behind plastic cups filled with cheap beer. 2 weeks until the wheels rolled over that park pavement and the family who once smirked at his hustle saw what it had become. And as he shut down for the night, heading toward a bed he used to lie awake in, wondering if he was wasting his life, he felt a quiet confidence settle over him. Not loud, not cocky, just calm. Because this time, he wasn't arriving to prove a point. He was arriving because he didn't need to anymore. The sky was a washout blue that day, the kind of heat-heavy mid-July sky that warned of sunburns and sweat-stained shirts before noon, but Derek didn't feel a drop of it as he turned into the long gravel entrance to Hickory Lake Park. Tires crunching slow and steady over the uneven path that led to the main picnic area. The car, that sleek, matte black, gliding machine that barely made a sound when it moved, didn't roar like the lifted trucks parked around the lot, didn't shake the ground like Dave's obnoxious diesel with its chrome pipes and American flag bumper sticker. It just slid into place like it had always belonged there, even if everyone else's expression suggested otherwise. Heads turned before the engine had even cooled. Aunt Gina, from behind a fold-out table stacked with half-covered aluminum trays, shaded her eyes with a paper plate and squinted at the figure behind the tinted windshield, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Cousin Dave, already 3 beers deep by the look of it, paused mid-sip, frown tightening like he'd just smelled something off. Rick, of course, always first to speak, always last to think, let out a low, amused whistle that cut through the buzzing noise of cicadas and lawn chairs scraping across concrete. "Damn," he muttered, dragging the word out like it was a punchline. Somebody hit the lotto. Derek didn't rush. He opened the door slowly, stepped out without the usual awkward hesitation he used to carry like a second skin. No tugging at his shirt, no self-conscious shuffling, no darting eyes looking for approval. He closed the car door behind him with a gentle click and looked around like he was just another guy showing up to a family reunion. Not a spectacle, not a mystery, just a man with keys in his hand and a quiet smile that didn't offer explanations. He walked across the grass like he wasn't hearing every whispered guess, every sideways glance. People were subtle in the way only family thinks they're subtle, the kind of subtle that might as well be shouting. A few cousins nodded, unsure whether to play it cool or ask questions they weren't sure how to phrase. One of the in-laws, Randy, maybe, married to his cousin Mindy, who always wore matching polos, muttered something about Tesla stock being real hot right now, as if that explained anything. Inside the tented picnic area, the tension crackled louder than the grill. It wasn't spoken outright, nobody came out and said it, but the vibe was obvious, hanging thick in the air between bites of burger and plastic forks scraping styrofoam plates. They all wanted to know the same thing, but none of them knew how to ask it without admitting they'd made up their minds about him years ago. So instead, they danced around it with vague, probing questions that tried to sound casual but landed like clumsy sucker punches. So Gina said, drawing out the word like it needed a longer runway to land, "You still doing your little thing?" She didn't even bother pretending to remember what it was. "You still working from home, or whatever?" Dave asked later after Derek passed him the ketchup. "Heard that's kind of fading out now, huh?" Even his mom, who had been quiet since he arrived, just smiled tightly and said, "You look good, honey. Healthy." Which, from her, was a layered statement loaded with more than just motherly pride. It was confusion, maybe even guilt. She didn't ask about work. Not really. None of them said the word job. It was like that word had been quarantined, forbidden to touch his presence unless it invited confrontation. Derek just nodded through it all, smiled when they tossed those little half-jokes his way, answered in short, polite phrases that said almost nothing but kept him just warm enough to avoid accusations of arrogance. He wasn't here to fight. He wasn't here to rub anything in. But he also wasn't going to explain himself. Not this time. Not anymore. Because deep down, he knew this was the moment he'd imagined back when things were falling apart and he couldn't even afford to fill his gas tank. The moment where they would have to sit with their discomfort and pretend they didn't notice the very thing they couldn't stop talking about behind their drinks. The only person who said what everyone else was thinking was Rick. Always Rick. "That's a hell of a car, Derek," he said with a crooked grin and a suspicious glint in his eye, like he was trying to figure out whether it was rented or stolen or part of some elaborate MLM scheme. "Whose is it?" he asked, loud enough that the question echoed under the tent canopy and made half the people nearby pause mid-chew. Derek didn't flinch. He just looked at him and smiled, not smug, not cold, just a quiet, confident smile that said everything without needing to say anything. He didn't answer. Not yet. Because he was still waiting. Not for permission. Not for their praise. But for the moment to arrive, the one where they'd stop circling and finally come face to face with the reality they'd refused to believe in. The truth was parked 15 feet away, humming silently, waiting like a question with no polite answer. And Derek? He wasn't in a hurry anymore. It happened the way most things happen in families like mine, half serious, half joking, and dipped in just enough sarcasm to give someone an out when the tension starts to tighten. Rick had been nursing a glass of whiskey since 2, the ice long melted into a watered-down swirl that matched the slow flush creeping up his sunburned neck. By the time the burgers were cold and the paper plates started piling up near the trash bags, he'd hit that part of his buzz where everything he said carried a little more weight, a little more volume, and a lot less filter. He was holding court near the grill, still wearing his sweat-stained baseball cap from the late 90s and a shirt with a faded American flag across the front that barely covered his growing gut. People were drifting toward the dessert table, scooping melted cherry pie onto collapsing plates, when Rick pointed across the lot toward the matte black machine that hadn't moved since Derek arrived. His voice cut through the conversation like a steak knife through undercooked meat. "Hey!" he shouted, lifting his glass and sloshing some of the amber liquid onto his sandals. "Whose spaceship is that sitting out front?" The crowd followed his finger, and a couple of chuckles floated through the air. Someone said something about Batman. Someone else asked if Elon Musk had RSVP'd. And then, just loud enough to carry, someone said, "I think it's Derek's." Rick snorted like the idea had personally offended him. "Bullshit," he barked, the word sharp and sudden, like he couldn't even entertain the possibility. "Derek's car? That thing out there?" "Come on." No one said anything. The silence that followed wasn't thick or dramatic, not yet. It was just long enough to let everyone realize what had been said and what hadn't. Derek stood a few feet away, watching it unfold like a slow-motion replay of every condescending remark, every backhanded compliment, every damn time he'd been laughed at or ignored or talked around in these kinds of gatherings. He didn't say a word. Not until the laughter started again, small and nervous, as if everyone needed permission to find it funny that Rick couldn't wrap his head around what was right in front of him. Then Derek walked forward. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't say anything until he was standing right in front of Rick, who was still smiling like he was waiting for the punchline. Derek reached into his pocket, pulled out the keys, and held them out not like a trophy, not like a mic drop, but like an invitation. "Mine," he said, voice low, steady. "Want a ride?" You could hear the air shift around them, like a balloon about to pop. Nobody moved. A fork scraped against a paper plate. Somewhere in the distance, a kid screamed about losing their flip-flop, but in that little circle of adults suddenly reminded that Derek wasn't a joke anymore. The world went still. Rick blinked, caught off guard in a way he couldn't hide, the grin faltering just enough to show the cracks underneath. His fingers closed around the keys like they might burn him, and for a second, he looked at Derek like he was trying to remember who he was. They walked to the car in silence. No applause. No whispers. Just footsteps over gravel and grass, two men who had nothing left to say, but everything unsaid, still sitting between them like smoke. The car beeped quietly when Rick unlocked the door, that soft, high-tech chirp that sounded like money and power and everything he didn't believe Derek could ever touch. He climbed into the passenger seat, his knees stiff, movements clumsy. Derek got in behind the wheel, tapped the start button, and the car hummed to life so quietly it felt like entering another universe. They pulled out of the lot without a word. Derek drove slow at first, just around the edges of the park, letting the car glide over the gravel like it was floating. Rick didn't speak. He looked around at the dashboard, the controls, the silent digital screens, all clean lines and sleek surfaces that didn't match anything he associated with Derek. He didn't ask questions, didn't throw out more jokes. He just stared ahead, jaw tight, fingers gripping the seatbelt like it might offer answers. They circled once. Twice. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy. It was the weight of every time Rick had laughed when Derek said he was freelancing, every dig about real jobs and man's work, every moment he dismissed Derek like a nephew who had gotten soft chasing internet dreams. It was the silence of a man slowly realizing that he'd been wrong. About the grind. About the path. About the kind of success you can't measure with pay stubs or trade skills or shiny new toolboxes. When Derek finally turned the car back into the lot, parking right where they'd started, he didn't say a thing. He just put it in park, looked straight ahead, and waited. Rick sat for a moment longer, then opened the door slowly, stepped out into the sunlight, and handed back the keys without looking him in the eye. He didn't make another joke. He didn't say, "Nice car." He just walked back toward the picnic tables like someone who had been handed a truth too sharp to swallow. Derek stayed seated a little longer, fingers still wrapped around the keys, the engine silent beneath him. It wasn't just a ride. It was a reckoning. They sat in silence for almost the entire loop around the park, Derek's hands resting steady on the wheel, his eyes scanning the familiar trees and dirt paths and picnic tables that looked smaller than they did when he was a kid, like everything else in this place. The expectations, The opinions, the voices had shrunk since he stopped giving them power. The car's interior hummed with that subtle electric sound that wasn't really a sound at all, just a vibration in the air that let you know you weren't sitting in some ordinary machine. And every now and then Derek glanced over at Rick, whose mouth stayed closed tight, like he was chewing on words he didn't know how to say. It wasn't until they pulled back into the grass lot, the engine easing into stillness with barely a whisper, that Rick finally broke the silence, his voice gruff and low, like it took effort to push the words out past whatever pride was still clinging to his ribs. "So, you rich now?" Derek stared through the windshield for a moment, watching his younger cousins throw a football near the picnic tables, one of them almost tripping over a cooler, and then he shrugged, not like he was trying to dodge the question, but like the question didn't have an answer simple enough to be honest. "I'm all right," he said, and it hung there in the space between them, more honest than yes, more complete than no. There was so much more he could have said in that moment. He could have listed the clients, dropped the names, pulled out his phone and opened the banking app, shown Rick the numbers that would have made his eyes widen and his jaw tighten. He could have talked about the podcast invitation, the feature in that digital entrepreneur magazine, the retainer contracts that hit his inbox without him even having to pitch anymore. He could have told him about the mornings he now spent in quiet, with no alarm clocks and no commutes and no bullshit meetings where people pretended to care about synergy. But he didn't say any of it because something in him knew that none of it would change anything that actually mattered. Rick didn't ask anything else. Just nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then got out of the car and walked away without another word. Derek sat there for another minute, maybe two, staring at his own reflection in the rearview mirror, and for the first time all day, he didn't feel triumphant. He just felt tired. Back at the reunion, the dynamic had shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. The way people looked at him a little longer before speaking, the way their eyes flicked toward the car and then quickly away, like staring at it too long might reveal something about themselves they weren't ready to face. Aunt Gina smiled too wide and told him he cleaned up nice. Cousin Dave made a comment about how text the future, before awkwardly transitioning into a story about refinancing his mortgage. One of the younger cousins, 21 maybe, fresh out of community college and lost as hell, came up and asked if Derek had any openings at his company, like he knew exactly what Derek had now and wanted a shortcut to get there. His mother, who had spent most of the afternoon watching from a polite distance, finally approached near the end of the day as Derek was standing alone, sipping lukewarm iced tea and pretending not to hear the whispers. She didn't say much, just touched his arm lightly and gave him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm glad you're okay," she said, and it wasn't cold, but it wasn't exactly warm either. It was the kind of phrase people use when they don't know how to say they were scared. Or sorry. Derek thanked her, nodded once, then stepped away. He didn't stay long after that. Said his goodbyes, gave a few handshakes, ignored a couple of questions about what exactly he does now, and walked back to the car without looking back. The engine whispered to life, and as he pulled out of the lot, a few of them waved half-heartedly, but most were already back to their conversations, their drinks, their tiny games of comparison and comfort. Life resumed as if he hadn't just tipped the balance of their silent social order. On the drive home, windows down, the car's interior cool with artificial intelligence and luxury stitching, Derek kept one hand on the wheel and the other on his thigh, tapping lightly, mind spinning. He should have felt like a king. Should have felt victorious. Should have been grinning ear to ear after 3 years of clawing his way out of the dirt. But all he felt was that strange, hollow ache you get when you finally climb the mountain and realize the view looks exactly like the one you imagined, only lonelier. The truth was, somewhere along the way, the dream had stopped being about joy and started being about proving them all wrong. And now that he'd done that, now that there were no more snide comments left to outrun, no more doubts to silence, there was this nagging emptiness, like he'd traded something precious to win a game he never really wanted to play in the first place. He thought about the early days, the ramen dinners, The unpaid gigs, the late nights on the floor surrounded by pizza boxes and anxiety, and he didn't miss the pain, but he missed the clarity. Back then, the only thing that mattered was building something that felt like his. Now he had it, the business, the money, the car, the freedom, and still, some part of him felt like the scoreboard hadn't moved. He pulled into his driveway, the sun dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the hood of the car. The house was quiet, clean, a long way from where he started. But as he sat there, keys in hand, engine off, he let the silence settle over him again, just like it had 3 years ago, back when everything was uncertain and nobody believed he'd make it. And then he said it aloud, not to anyone in particular, not for effect, but because the truth has a way of needing to be heard. I got the car. I got the money. I got the respect. But sometimes I miss being the idiot with nothing but a laptop and a stupid dream.